everybody, and welcome to Barbara's Banter to this edition. My co host Brian Boyer and I are just delighted to have you today. Joining us today as our guest is Dr. David Renwick, the senior pastor of National Presbyterian Church right here in Washington, D.C., and I will more formally introduce him in just a moment. As you know, February is Black History Month. And we thought it very appropriate to have a discussion. It's such a complex topic that we will never be able to cover the waterfront in such a short time. But Lang Strategies certainly wanted to be a part of the discussion. So much has been written and so many videos shown since the knee on the neck of George Floyd last year. And in fact, there were several instances of the injustice done to many African Americans and other people of color. Those of us that are African Americans have known about this forever, for so long, decades and maybe hundreds of years. But now that we have cameras on cell phones, white America is becoming attuned and woke, as they say, to what has been going on, the ugliness that has existed in parts of our society for so long and that have been suppressed. So today we thought that we would contribute to the discussion on race and on Barbara's Banter, and we want to talk more about race equity in the workplace, but that is for part two. So I mentioned today that our guest today is Dr. Renwick. And I want to tell you a little bit about his background. He has been 40 years a Presbyterian minister, serving in places like Canada, Texas, Kentucky, South Carolina, and now Washington, D.C. for several years. He is from Scotland, and you'll hear a little bit of that in his accent. And he did his initial studies there, and then got his PhD from Union Theological Seminary in Virginia. Now, you may ask why Brian and I decided to have a Presbyterian minister on a podcast that deals with leadership issues, change management, and other business issues. And the reason is last summer, Dr. Renwick did a series for his congregation on matters of race. And I viewed it and I just thought it was wonderful. And I was overwhelmed by it and one of the best that I had seen. So I thought it appropriate for him to be with us today at the start of this series to talk about race and give us a little historical perspective. I also, in the spirit of full disclosure, I attend National Presbyterian Church. And so Dr. Renwick is my minister. So David, thank you for being here today and welcome.
Thank you, Barbara and Brian. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to share in the broader discussion. And I trust in the context of leadership, which is really important to me as well.
Exactly. Well, I will get on to my first question and then I'll pitch it to Brian after a couple of questions. You're white minister. Your congregation is primarily white. Why did you think it important to have this discussion with your congregation last year?
Thank you for the question. So I tend to think of myself in many respects as a gradualist, that I get involved in things after I've thought about them for a long time. And then generally I kind of make sure that I circle the wagons a bit. But as you mentioned, the situations one after another in the early part of last year were overwhelming to me as a white guy. Mm-hmm. And I think the visual nature of it and the knee on the neck, and at some point you go, it doesn't really, it's not just about race, though it is about race. This is terrible. And so there's this sense of shock that this is happening. But more than that, about 10% of our congregation are non-white, whether it's African American or Asian background or other backgrounds. but from my African-American friends, I heard some real terror in their voices. And these are just normal people who are trying to live their lives. And there's this edge. And I'm a pastor. So when I hear that in any member of my congregation, it stirs me up and says, what's going on in their lives that I can address? So you've got this pastoral element as well. But I also heard from my African-American fellow pastors. So I'm in a number of groups where we meet together once, twice, 3 times a year. And the word from them was, the silence in the white church is overwhelming. And just the saying nothing, and we're hearing nothing. And that hit me hard. And I know that I, like others, say, well, what exactly am I supposed to say? Maybe I'll say the wrong thing. But what I heard from them was, we're not too concerned that you say the wrong thing. We just want you to say something.
Right.
And this sense of, before you get it all right, say what you think, say what you feel, say what you know, and just say it. So I felt that is really a pretty strong conviction coming from in my congregation and beyond the congregation, and then nationally. And these kind of 3 things converged. And I said to myself, I want to say something. And I'd certainly been thinking about this, but I'm not sure I'd pulled my thoughts together until that moment of conviction.
It was a powerful series, and I certainly have not said this to you, but perhaps have said this to Brian, that I'm a child of the 60s, so I grew up in the civil rights movement, and I marched, and I never went to jail, but I did my fair share of marching and all. I'm too old to do that now, but I have never felt such terror, even back then, that I felt last year. And that's saying something, because that was the time when, you had the Ku Klux Klan walking around with the hoods and the robes and all, but I never really felt as scared as I did last year. And of course it continues. It's still going on. It has not gone away. When you talked last year, and I remember that you're talking a bit about racism in other countries, and you specifically talked about Scotland, and kind of how that manifested itself back when you lived there. Can you take us through a little bit of that discussion?
Sure. So I was a child of the 60s, and growing up in the 60s in Scotland, maybe 3% of the country was non-white. We had some English there, but we were mostly all Scots. That's who we were.
Right.
And so the issue of race as such seemed to be far, far away. But as I've been thinking about race in the last year especially, but I think probably longer than that, some of the divisions within the white society, I think, are part of the discussion. And this was part of my series, saying not all of the discussion by any sense of the imagination, but part of this discussion. And Black authors such as Beverly Tatum and Isabel Wilkerson have picked up on this, that within this white society, class is a huge distinction. I mean, a massive distinction. Education is a massive distinction. Poverty is a massive distinction. Who lives on what side of the town?
Right.
It's still a major, these are major distinctions. Even the way people dress, you can tell who's us and you can tell who's them. And this sense that this is going on within a society which is white began to resonate with me. And indeed, at some point, someone somewhere, and I have no clue, talked about World War I and World War II as European tribal warfare between the white tribes of Europe. And obviously, the race issue arises very clearly with Nazi Germany and those who are Jewish, and that's white. But this sense that actually the various nations are, in a sense, tribal, and there's this internal struggle, and the language, even to this day, of stereotyping in Europe is remarkable. And when I go back to Scotland, what I listen to, I go, whoa, you can't say that out loud. So my understanding of divisions within people, and let me add majority and minority issues. So the Scots are a 5 million minority in a 65 million person nation. Great Britain is about 65 million. And so you've also got a sense of groups within groups. They're all white in this case. And this happening in society as a whole. And then thinking about the race problem, what occurred to me as I kept reading Black history, and I think this is a huge issue for white people, the lack of knowledge of Black history in this country, the realization that on top of these things, and I think they all play their part, you have the clear identity based on looks, on skin color. And this hit home to me. I know that many of my Scottish forebears came to this country as indentured servants. Scotland's a poor country, and they sort of sold themselves to get a passage out of where they were, as many Europeans did. But when their 7 years of indentured servitude were over, they blended back into the society in a way that Black people never could. And so you might be a freed slave, but as Frederick Douglass biographies point out, there was still something which was automatic and visceral there. So I bring all of that sense outside of the black and white context to say that for me, that's part of the discussion. And in particular, Isabel Wilkerson's recent book on caste, which has been a New York Times bestseller, for me has been profoundly helpful to understand what's going on. So it's not just that. I think the color issue is so visual that it has added an extra dimension here in the United States, which is obviously profoundly sad, but a significant part of it. So yes, it's not just caste or education. It is kind of a visual racial issue here. So that's kind of how I've approached it. I'd also say that when I came to this country, I came to study my theology, my master's degree. My roommate was African-American from Pittsburgh, and living together for a year was a kind of an awakening as well for me. So yes, recently I've been thinking about it, but 35, 40 years ago, it was as if this was presented on my plate to begin to process and think about there.
Interesting. Brian?
Yeah, David, and actually, I actually want to throw this up to both of you, kind of from two different perspectives, because David, I have to say, but the reference that Barbara made about the whole idea of being even in more fear over the past year than she was growing up, and I do remember, Barbara, you and I having that conversation, and that really hit me, and it wasn't like it's not as though my head was in the sky, not understanding what was going on around me.
Right.
But I guess I didn't realize. I mean, to me, that was really scary that you said that. I mean, we're talking about a civil rights movement. We've seen footage of the anger and the hatred, and here Barbara is, right, a leader, somebody who's well respected, saying it's actually worse now. Right. So I guess my question, and I want to ask this to David, but also Barbara, I want you to kind of weigh in on this as well. And when you look at coverage on the news or you see things on social media, you actually see hatred in people's faces. If you look at people's eyes sometimes when they're confronting someone who's a different color than they are, and they probably don't even know that person, right? But there's a hate in their eyes. There's an evil in their eyes. And I'm wondering, both of you, what's causing this hatred? And I know that sounds kind of cliche. We've been asking that question for years, but is there anything specific now that's making it even more visceral? Is it the media? Is it politics? Is it all of the above? because it is scary. And Barbara made a very good, really interesting point when she said that it's worse now than it was back then. So I'll let you guys kind of answer that.
David, I'll let you.
I mean, that certainly is a difficult question to come up with a clear answer. I think the divisions in society as a whole, let's put it this way, the loss of cohesion in society as a whole is a huge factor in this as it plays out politically as well as racially. And the sense that that other group identities, which are highly emotional, have gained great power. I mean, that's always been the case, but there's been something in the last 5 to 10 years in which we have, and let's put it this way, in white society, invested in group identity, and I'll just use Republican or Democrat as one sense of identity, where it's just so overwhelming that if you're not in with me, I have the right to demonize you. And whereas once again, this is not completely true. I think there was more holding people together. So I think about Lincoln's team of rivals leading the nation, and nobody seems to be willing to do that anymore, to get a team of rivals which kind of hold to some kind of central truths together, which then leads to another issue, which is in fact the issue of truth, and has become my truth, and my truth is not your truth. And if you challenge my truth, you're challenging me. So things have become very personal on the one hand, and then very group and well, we've seen it, mob identity on the other. Mobs are scary. No matter what they are, there's a sense that you cannot control them. And I would tend to think that terror and fear is really in the face of the uncontrollable, which we don't know what's going to happen. And we can say anything we want, but we don't know what effect it will have.
So Barbara, based on what David is saying, then I guess the second part of that question would be for you. How much do you see? Because I know you're a news junkie as well, right?
All day long.
You and I always bonded about, right? You know, the TV's on, you're watching what, you know, different channels that have different spins on things. But in your viewpoint, how much is the media factoring into this? How much are politics factoring into this? You know, some of us will go do research on things if we hear it on TV to make sure it's actually validated, and others will just kind of take the word of our leaders or our media. What have you seen on that?
Well, I think certainly the media plays a role in it, because we've got a 24-hour news cycle now. And so the news is on all the time, and it's played over and over and over again. So I think that clearly has an impact. And, you know, most of us will go and do our research on things that we see and hear to be sure it's accurate. I think the majority of America does not do that. And so they'll align, or depending on however they lean, whether far right or far left, they will tend to believe whatever it is they're hearing. I also think that so many people that were in that mob on January 6th, and many of them, by the way, because they interviewed several of them, didn't even vote. They didn't vote one way or the other. And so it's just ironic that that they would go and storm the Capitol. But so many of those people are just feel that something has been taken away from them. And I don't know whether sometimes, it's power, whether it's the forecast that, you know, in 30 years or so, people of color will be the majority, and people are very scared about that being taken away from them. I do think that having the first African-American president for 8 years was something that that even though, you know, President Obama got a majority of the vote, he won fair and square on both of his terms. but there was a segment of the population that did not like that and felt that something, a Black man in the White House, a Black family in the White House, and had real trouble dealing with that. And then you had these very far right people drilling that into their heads all day long. And so that's kind of, where we are. And it's sad. I know last year, I will be very honest, I considered leaving this country and moving to another country because it bothered me so much. And the challenge is, where do you go? I mean, I looked at a couple of places, but where do you go? Because you've got issues like here, perhaps not in the same way in other countries as well. But 2 or 3 of my friends and I very seriously considered doing that because we were so distraught at what we saw going on here in America. So I don't know whether that answers you.
It does answer the question, and then begs a lot of other questions as well.
I
But I'll
know,
kick it
I
back to you, Barbara. I know, I know you have a couple more things, and then I have a couple as we start to get towards the second part of the second half of the show here. 'Cause
Right.
This is a topic we can obviously talk about for weeks, years, right?
That's right.
But Barbara, I'll kick it back to you on kind of the next part here.
Well, I'll ask David, do you think we're witnessing a real breakdown in the moral fabric of our country? And what's that impact? How do you see it from your perspective?
So I think we're seeing a real change in the country, and I would link a lot of the anger to rapid change.
Mhm.
And this we'll come back to the moral question, but I think the rapidity of change is scary for many people, and some of that is the loss of power and control, and the loss of perception about what the country is, whether that perception is right or wrong.
Right.
You mentioned at the beginning that I've lived all over the nation, and I count this to be a wonderful privilege, having been able to live in Massachusetts and Virginia and here in DC and Kentucky and Texas and South Carolina. Some of these have been rural places. And I suspect that some of the folks in some of my smaller churches would vote quite differently from some of my folks in other places. In fact, I think they voted differently all over the map. But in some places, I think you're absolutely right. It's just inconceivable that there could have been a Black president. Something must have gone wrong somewhere.
Exactly.
And so you can't define it. And the undefinable, along with the uncontrollable, is also very scary. And it's very amorphous, and you can't get a handle on it. But something must be wrong. So I think that rapid change is it's scary in business, it's scary in families, it's scary wherever we are, and we tend to take it out on someone.
Mhm.
I certainly know from a pastoral counseling point of view, the most intractable issues that people face occur when actually the real problem is not the presenting problem. There's something else going on deep beneath, and you keep on dealing with the problem, but actually until you get to the root of it, it'll never go away. So I do think things like that are occurring. In terms of moral breakdown in our nation, I think we're seeing some good things happening. I mean, I really do think that in some places in the nation, racially, things are going quite well. I think the use of violence as a tactic, I think we have to address that. In fact, the statistics, even against whites compared to Europe, for example, are just horrendous. And then that's exacerbated against the Black community. I think there are things, particularly in policing, that need to be changed. And this is so difficult because the majority of police are doing it because they want to serve their communities and so forth. But there are some things that need to change there in particular. In terms of morality as a whole, for me, the issue of truth is obviously I'm a Christian, I'm a pastor. The issue of truth is really important. Not only how do we grasp it, but how do we live with people who don't agree with us? And I think that's an important part of whatever truth that we believe in. But the loss of really some common values. And I'd come back here to the Constitution. I know we debate over the Constitution, but I certainly think that a good dose of everybody being aware of what is the founding document that we have, and including the Declaration of Independence there, to say if we lose a sense that these bind us together, then we're all out to sea. We don't have any central core to bind us together, and that loss of some kind of central core, I think, means it's very hard to speak into the moral aspect of this with any kind of unified voice. Makes it more complicated. And then the media, with people listening to the media they want to listen to, as opposed to I'm going to spend 60% on the stuff I like, but I'm going to give 40% to the stuff I don't like, because they're probably going to say some things that are helpful. Right. It becomes so siloed that the conversation across lines is in many ways more complicated now than 10, 15 years ago.
Well, given what you just said, how do you suggest that we reconcile, or can we, and begin the healing? You're my minister, so how do we do this?
Do they train for that at theological school? I don't know. That's a tough one.
I don't think they really do. So I think it's it's like the environmental slogan, think globally, act locally.
Right.
And you've got to keep the big picture in mind. But I certainly, our particular, many congregations have become polarized along political party lines. Our particular congregation has for decades, and we're in DC where that can happen easily, for decades, it's been pretty fundamental to our DNA to make sure we don't do that. Mm-hmm. So that fighting that easy descent into that division, and to say, actually, the holding of some kind of center is really important to us. But that's true racially as well. It's true theologically, it's true politically, it's true racially, and probably in other ways, to say that we will not allow our congregation to be single-minded on these things. Now, we've got a central core to our faith, which we hope is single-minded in God, and we're Christians, but that we will deliberately work to create a community with space for many people. And I realize there are limits to that in any organization. Mm-hmm. There have to be boundaries and limits, but to say that we will be very careful about pulling those boundaries too tight. So I would say that that would be true for our church, and maybe where our listeners are, in whatever organization they are, that we hold this to be true. I actually learned a lot from Peter Drucker way back, and with maximize strengths and minimize weaknesses. Don't get rid of these people, but play to your strengths, allowing for that diversity in the organization, or your organization will not work there. Along with teaching what I think is fundamental from a Christian point of view. God made us all in God's image. That's a Judeo-Christian idea, the very book of Genesis, and from a Christian perspective, that Christ died for us all. And two fundamental beliefs. So people examining what is our core belief and how does that impact this, making sure that it's not just personal, but it translates into whatever community we're a part of, where we are. That would be important to me.
I know it's I certainly get disillusioned and wonder whether we can ever get beyond some of this. And it's awfully disheartening to see. But we shall trudge on. Giving up is not an option. So, so we have to do better. I think that's probably all we have time for today. And as I said at the beginning, there is so much to cover. Dr. Renwick, or as my granddaughter would call you, would say, Pastor David, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your intellect and your perspective today. I think we have advanced the discussion. We certainly have not solved the issue, but we have at least gotten a different perspective of things. And to all of you that have joined us today, thank you for tuning in. Brian and I really appreciate that. And part 2 of this discussion will focus on racial equity in the workplace. And we will have an executive from a Fortune 500 company who developed and implemented their diversity and inclusion program. And this person also has military background, has law enforcement and local government. She used to be a judge here in Washington. And so we will have a discussion around various segments of our economy and society. So join us for part 2. But David, thank you again so much for being our guest on part 1. Thanks, everybody. Take care.